In 2025, the descendants of some Nazi leaders continue to confront their ancestors' legacy in diverse ways. Raina Hurse, grandson of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Hurse, has dedicated his life to Holocaust education and promoting tolerance. His activism has been controversial, and he has faced criticism even within his own family. At 60, he speaks at conferences and events, sharing his expertise in combating antisemitism and extremism. Katherine Himmler, born in 1967 and great-niece of Heinrich Himmler, has addressed her family's past through writing. In her book The Brothers Himmler, A German Family History, she explores her relatives' involvement in the Nazi regime. Married to an Israeli and mother of one son, she has chosen to keep her family name, confronting her family history and promoting reflection on historical memory in Germany. Betatina Guring, Hermann Göring's great-niece, made drastic decisions to distance herself from the Nazi legacy. A resident of Santa Fe, New Mexico, she underwent voluntary sterilization in her 30s to avoid passing on her lineage. At 68, she lives a quiet life away from the public eye and has participated in documentaries such as Hitler's Children, where she shares her experiences and reflects on her heritage. Born of the Reich, the curse of a surname. Raina Hurse was 15 years old when he learned who his grandfather had really been. During a school visit to the Dachau camp, he recognized the face of Rudolf Hurse on an information panel. Until that moment, that image had been part of the family album, without context, without warning. Discovering that this same man had been the commandant of Auschwitz and directly responsible for more than 1 million murders was like crashing into a truth that had been deliberately buried. He returned home looking for answers, but he found evasions, justifications, denials. He discovered that his family had lived in a large house with a garden next to the extermination camp, that the children played on the lawn while a few meters away the gas chambers operated like machines of death, that the horror had been present but unspoken. It was then that he understood that lies were also part of his legacy. Raina chose to cut ties. He broke with his family, moved to another city, and turned his life into an act of confrontation. He visited schools and concentration camps, confronted deniers and neo-Nazis. In 2009, his father officially disowned him. Since then, he has lived in various European countries, including Sweden and Germany, where he lives with intermittent protection due to threats from extremist groups. He founded an educational organization called Footsteps, which collaborates with institutions such as Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and several schools in Central Europe. His work consists of exposing, through family documents, how the banality of evil operated within an ordinary household. His surname, which for decades was a symbol of silence, became a banner of denunciation. He has paid the price. He was disinherited. He has received threats, and there are those who accuse him of seeking prominence. But for him, silence is complicity, and when a Hurse speaks about Auschwitz, denying it is impossible. Among the gestures that marked his career, one was especially symbolic: the public embrace he shared at Auschwitz with Eva Moses, Kor, a survivor of Josef Mengeler's experiments. The image went around the world. Some saw it as an act of healing, others as a gesture difficult to accept. Raina wasn't seeking absolution, but rather a connection. His presence at the place where his grandfather directed the extermination was part of a personal journey from which there is no return. Today, he declares himself religiously unaffiliated but maintains close ties with Jewish communities in Berlin. He doesn't speak from inherited guilt, but from a constructed conscience, and what he offers isn't answers but presence. Several miles away in Hamburg, a woman was browsing books in the library, unaware that one of them would change her life forever. Jennifer Teague, an Afro-German, was adopted by a white family. Her identity until then had been built around her African heritage and her closeness to Israeli culture. She lived in Tel Aviv, learned Hebrew, and cultivated deep friendships. But when she found a book that mentioned her biological mother, she discovered something that shattered her world. Her maternal grandfather was Eamon Goeth, commandant of the Poisson camp, the same man portrayed in Schindler's List as the man who shot prisoners from his balcony. The blow was twofold. Not only was she the granddaughter of a war criminal, but under the laws of the regime her grandfather defended, she herself would have been considered inferior, even eliminable. The mixture of blood in her body turned her into a living paradox, half executioner, half victim. She fell into a deep depression. She required psychiatric treatment. The process of reconstruction was long and painful, but she found in writing a channel to stay afloat. Her book, Amun, My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me, is a brutal testimony to that duality that inhabits her. It was written in collaboration with journalist Nicola Selmer, who investigated the family's past and interviewed Jennifer's biological mother to reconstruct the inherited silences. Published in 2013 by Random House, the work became an immediate bestseller in Germany, was translated into more than 15 languages, and distributed in the United States by The Experiment. Its impact was international, sparking debates about identity, race, and memory in countries such as France, Poland, Israel, and Japan. Jennifer doesn't dissociate herself from her story. She explores it, she dismantles it, she exhibits it. Her very body becomes a political act. It is the living refutation of her grandfather's racial ideology. Her existence exposes the fallacy of the purity that the Nazis defended with weapons and laws. Her testimony, therefore, is not only familial, it is symbolic. She has participated in conferences organized by Yad Vashem, in reconciliation workshops in Berlin, and at TEDx conferences in Hamburg. She has also been interviewed on networks such as ZDF, ARD, and France 24, and appears in documentaries such as Descendants of the Reich and My Nazi Legacy. She has been invited to share her story in German schools on several occasions as part of anti-racism education programs. In recent interviews, she has recounted that maintaining contact with her biological mother was one of the most complex challenges of the process. There was no full reconciliation, but neither was there a definitive break. The relationship was suspended between the need to understand and the impossibility of erasing the past. Both she and her mother faced the same legacy from different places, one through silence and the other through exposure. Jennifer, however, chose to transform the damage into a narrative. She currently lives in Hamburg, has 2 children, and continues to work as an author, speaker, and advocate for anti-racist education. She defines herself as a hybrid citizen, someone who doesn't entirely belong to a single country, language, or history, and who found strength precisely in that fracture. Not everyone reacted the same way. Katherine Himmler, great-niece of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and architect of the final solution, grew up in an environment where the surname was used without shame. In her home, Uncle Heinrich was barely a shadowy figure, a presence mentioned with a certain almost decorative distance. But history burst forth unexpectedly when a schoolmate asked her if she was related to that Himmler. The question sowed a concern that germinated over the years. When Katherine became a mother, she faced a decision. What story would she tell her son? She chose not to remain silent. She began researching her family tree and discovered that her grandfather, Ernst Himmler, had been more than just a bystander. As an active member of the party and signatory of discriminatory documents, he was a cog in the wheel of the regime. Ernst worked as a sound engineer at Reich State Radio, and from there he participated in the dissemination of Nazi propaganda during the key years of the conflict. His involvement was not military, but ideological, and his signature appears on directives related to censorship and information control. For Katherine, these documents were proof that evil also manifested itself from seemingly innocuous desks. He published The Brothers Himmler, a book that not only delves into Heinrich's crimes but also shows how Nazism infected everyday life. The home, the workplace, the family table, everything was part of the system. Published in 2005, the work generated intense controversy in Germany. It was received with academic respect, but also with public discomfort, as it exposed family details that many still preferred to keep hidden. The research included the analysis of more than 1,000 private letters between Heinrich, his wife Margaret, and their daughter Gudrun, as well as personal documents that showed how Nazi ideology had been internalized in domestic life. His work dispelled the myth of partial guilt. That's why he decided to keep his family name as an act of confrontation. Changing it would be hiding behind a lie, he said. In his case, the legacy was transformed into active memory, not a silent burden. Katherine Himmler has since participated in panel discussions on memory pedagogy, collaborating with institutions such as the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich and the Topography of Terror Foundation in Berlin. She has stated that her mission is not to redeem her family, but to document, expose, and warn. From her residence in Berlin, she works as a political scientist specializing in international relations, but she has never abandoned her commitment to historical memory. In recent interviews, she has said that the greatest challenge was not accepting the truth, but explaining it to her son without sugarcoating it. In her case, the past was not an isolated wound, but an inherited structure that she decided to dismantle with precision and clarity. And then there's Betatina Guring, grandniece of Hermann Göring, founder of the Gestapo and second in command in the Nazi hierarchy. Her response was different, more intimate, more radical. At 30, she decided to be sterilized. She didn't want to have children, not for medical reasons, but for symbolic ones. She wanted to ensure that her family name wouldn't be repeated, that her line would die out with her. She grew up in a family where Nazism was still defended. Her grandmother displayed portraits of Hermann in the living room and denied the Holocaust. Bettina fled that adolescent environment, lived in communes, traveled the world, and sought refuge in ways of life opposed to her family's ideology. Her sterilization wasn't just an operation, it was a political act, a final statement. Her brother made the same decision. Both believed the genetic burden should not continue. In interviews, Bettina explained that she was afraid that something in her blood could repeat itself, as if the trauma of the past were biologically filtering into the future. Bettina's story became public knowledge through the documentary Bloodlines, 2007, where she shared the screen with Rudolf Höss's granddaughter. There, she recounted her decision calmly, without theatricality, as if silence were her only form of reparation. Following that appearance, she was contacted by media outlets and universities, but consistently rejected all invitations. She never wanted to become a spokesperson for anything, not even as a victim of the family name. Bettina doesn't write books, give talks, or seek the spotlight. She lives in New Mexico, practices alternative therapies, and grows medicinal plants. She resides on the outskirts of Taos, in a house she helped build with natural materials, far from noise, discourse, and public history. She hasn't made the past a spectacle, but rather a silent life choice. While other descendants confront history with words, she does so with her body. Her response is not public, but internal. She doesn't seek to convince anyone, only to inhabit the world without prolonging a heritage she considers cursed. 4 different responses, 4 ways of carrying an impossible legacy. Raina chose denunciation, Jennifer writing, Katherine research, Bettina extinction. None of these paths is easy. None guarantees peace, but all reject denial. And that, in a world where there are still those who deny the Holocaust, is a form of resistance. Because it's not just about names or genetics. It's about how to respond when the past calls from the shadows, and you decide, in your own way, to remain silent. Inherited silence, when silence is a form of loyalty. While some descendants of the Third Reich chose to publicly confront their family history, others opted for silence as a strategy. This isn't a matter of forgetting, but rather a conscious decision. The most emblematic case is that of Klaus Ikeman, the eldest son of Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the logistics of the Holocaust. Klaus grew up in Argentina under the cover identity his father had adopted after the war, Ricardo Ikeman. In that environment, surrounded by exiled German communities and former Nazis, the family narrative was clear. Ikeman was not a criminal, but a victim. He was not a genocidal perpetrator, but an obedient civil servant, betrayed by history. When the Mossad kidnapped his father in 1960 and secretly transported him to Israel for trial, Klaus didn't hesitate. He publicly defended him. He accused the Jews of manipulating the justice system. He reproduced the antisemitism with which he had been raised, and he didn't just speak his mind. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Klaus was interviewed by several Argentine media outlets, including Critica and La Prensa, where he repeated the versions his father had offered in his defense. He declared that his father was only following orders and that history would be rewritten fairly one day. He remained the family spokesperson until Eichmann's execution in June 1962. After the execution, Klaus remained active in revisionist circles for at least a decade. According to reports from the Simon Center Wiesenthal of the 1970s, his name appears linked to denialist publications printed in Buenos Aires. Although there are no official records of a formal organization named Argentine National Socialist Front, There were informal groups of German exiles who distributed Nazi propaganda from clandestine printing presses. Klaus is said to have coordinated some of these activities from the Buenos Aires neighborhood of Belgrano. His brother, Horst Ikeman, was also part of the circle, more reserved but equally committed to the cause. While Klaus spoke in front of the cameras, Horst organized meetings, brokered contacts with former SS members, and coordinated youth activities with a Nazi aesthetic. In 1983, Horst was interviewed by journalist Peter F. Müller for a series of reports on the generation that inherited the Third Reich. In that interview, Horst reiterated that his father's conviction had been unjust and referred to the trial as a spectacle staged by Israel for political revenge. He also stated that he was not ashamed of bearing the Eichmann surname. He lived in Argentina until his death in the 1990s without publicly recanting his beliefs. What's remarkable about the Eichmann case is not only the explicit defense of Nazism, but the degree of elaboration of the silence surrounding the crime. In their home, the Holocaust didn't exist as a reality. It was an invention, a conspiracy. The trains, the camps, the millions of deaths. All of this was part of an international smear campaign. This is how Klaus and Horst grew up. This is how their identities were shaped. Kai Hurse, Rudolf Hurse's grandson, represents another form of silence, the complete disappearance of the narrative. Unlike his cousin Raina, who broke with his family and became an active voice against antisemitism, Kai chose not to speak, not to give interviews, not to participate in documentaries, not to publish books, not even to deny, simply to remain silent. There are no public statements from him. There are no current images, only bureaucratic records confirming his existence. In some of Raina's lectures, when he is mentioned, the gesture is always the same: respect for the decision to remain silent, but also sadness. Because silence, in these contexts, is not neutral. It is a form of position, a way of letting the family story remain intact, unchallenged. Silence can also be a survival strategy, as in the case of Waltraud Heim, daughter of the infamous Nazi doctor Aribert Heim, known as Dr. Death, fled after the war and lived for decades under a false identity in South America. He was one of the world's most wanted Nazi criminals, responsible for atrocious crimes, lethal injections in the heart, operations without anesthesia, and experimental amputations. In 2006, it was discovered that Waltraud was living in Chile. In a brief statement, she stated that her father had died in 1993. She showed no emotion. She offered no details. She expressed no condemnation. Most revealing was what happened next. She tried to access a Swiss bank account, supposedly opened by her father, containing a sum of millions. The problem: she couldn't produce the death certificate. The account, opened at UBS Bank under a coded number, contained approximately 1.2 million euros. The Austrian court demanded documentary evidence of Heim's death, but neither Waltraud nor her brother were able to provide it. The Baden District Court rejected the request for the release of funds in 2010 due to a lack of conclusive evidence. That same year, the German channel ZDF and the New York Times published a joint investigation confirming that Aribert Heim had lived under the name Tarek Farid Hussein in Cairo for over 20 years. He reportedly lived in a boarding house in the Docky neighborhood and received treatment at local hospitals with Egyptian identification. He died in 1992 of intestinal cancer. Local witnesses, including the boarding house owner and a doctor, confirmed his identity after comparing photographs. The German court formally closed the search for him in 2012, although without issuing a retroactive arrest warrant for his sons. In Germany, a recent study revealed that more than 60% of the descendants of SS members never spoke to their children about their ancestors' role. In many cases, family documents were destroyed, photo albums were hidden, testimonies were never recounted. In the words of one of the researchers, it's a transmission of horror by omission. The data comes from a study coordinated by the Free University of Berlin in collaboration with the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, IFZ, presented in 2013 following a survey of more than 500 immediate relatives of former Nazi officials. According to the report, 64% of those surveyed stated that their parents or grandparents never discussed the Nazi past at family gatherings. Only 7% admitted to having received direct explanations about the events. The same report details that in 38% of the cases analyzed, descendants discovered the family link to the Nazi regime through external sources, news reports, school archives, books, or third-party testimonies. Many of the testimonies collected coincide in a pattern: the deliberate destruction of papers, letters, and photographs after the German surrender. The project was led by German historian Alexandra Senft, granddaughter of a senior Nazi diplomat, and was based on interviews conducted between 2009 and 2012. The objective was not to moralize, but to document the family mechanisms that allowed the continued silence. The study was accompanied by a publication entitled Schweigen tut weh, Silence Hurts, published by the Kerber Foundation, in which some participants described their bewilderment upon discovering the exact roles of their relatives within the Third Reich. The end of the surname, the biological rebellion. Betatina Guring was born with one of the most burdensome surnames in modern German history. Her great-uncle, Hermann Göring, was one of the founders of the Third Reich, head of the Luftwaffe, organizer of the Nazi economic apparatus, and one of the greatest art looters during World War II. From a young age, Bettina noticed that her last name provoked reactions: awkward silences, averted glances, distance. At home, the subject was taboo. Her grandmother, close to Hermann Göring during the regime, denied everything: the crimes, the camps, the story. The break came at age 13. Unable to bear the denialist environment, Bettina ran away from home and began a wandering life. She took refuge in hippie communes, spiritual movements, and alternative communities. She sought an identity untainted by her family name. In the midst of that search, she made a radical decision. She voluntarily sterilized herself. She didn't want to have children. She didn't want to prolong her lineage. "I was afraid that something in my blood would repeat itself," she declared in an interview. Her brother made the same decision. He expressed it in a phrase as powerful as it was symbolic: "I cut the line." This gesture wasn't just medical. It was a biological break with the past. It was like saying, "This ends here," to a story that wasn't chosen but inherited. Today, Bettina lives in northern New Mexico, where she leads a life far removed from any institutional presence. She participates in alternative healing practices, works with plants and energy techniques, and completely avoids the media spotlight. She declines invitations to forums on historical memory, although her face appears in several documentaries, including Descendants, of the Reich and Hitler's Children. He only agreed to appear on the condition that his story not be politicized. Despite the passage of time, he maintains no contact with the rest of his family and has never tried to rebuild bridges. Their breakup was definitive. In his own words, "History doesn't need to repeat itself if you don't carry it with you." A similar decision was made by Adolf Hitler's great-nephews, descendants of the dictator's half-brother, Alois Hitler Jr. In the United States, they lived under the surname Stuart Houston. The family settled on Long Island, New York, and maintained a low profile for decades. Louis, Brian, Howard, and Alexander were born after the war, raised by William Patrick Hitler, their British nephew who had emigrated to the US and fought in the Navy during World War II. Although they tried to completely distance themselves from their original surname, their past resurfaced in scattered news reports in the 1970s and 2000s. In an interview with British journalist David Gardner, published in 2006, one of the brothers confirmed that they had made a tacit agreement: neither would have children. They did not wish to prolong Hitler's biological lineage, nor risk being associated with some kind of symbolic legacy. "We didn't want to convey any of that," one of them said. "We knew what that last name meant. It doesn't matter if we changed it, it's always there." The four brothers never participated in conferences or gave extensive interviews. They turned down book and documentary proposals. They worked in common jobs. One was a nurse, another worked as a technician, and another as a landscaper. They lived in a simple house in Patchogue, with American flags on the porch and a deliberately bland life. Louis died in 2007, Brian died in 1989, Howard died in 2023. Only Alexander Adolf Stuart Houston is still alive, according to public records. He lives in retirement, has no children, and avoids public appearances. The Stuart Houston family's story is not marked by discourses of blame or vindication. They never took political action. They issued no condemnations or defenses. But their decision, made in the privacy of their family, had definitive consequences. Adolf Hitler's biological lineage ended with them. Neither wanted their surname, real or changed, to regain historical significance. In an era where many crave exposure, they opted for symbolic disappearance. In their case, the break was absolute. They chose not to leave a trace. Memory without spectacle, living with truth without noise. Ricardo Ikeman, born in Buenos Aires in 1955, was the last son of Adolf Eichmann, the man who masterminded the logistics of the Holocaust. Unlike his older siblings, who grew up with a family narrative that portrayed their father as a martyr of duty, Ricardo lived his childhood without fully knowing who Ricardo Clement was, the false name under which his father was hiding in Argentina. When Eichmann was captured by the Mossad in 1960 and taken to Israel, Ricardo was 5 years old. His father was executed 2 years later, following a historic trial that exposed all the bureaucratic mechanisms of Jewish extermination. The family returned to Germany, and there Ricardo began a life marked by contradiction. It wasn't at home that Ricardo learned the truth. It was through books, documents, and archives that he discovered who his father had really been, and it was in this solitary process that he decided not to follow in the footsteps of his brothers. While Klaus and Horst justified the regime's crimes and publicly defended Adolf Eichmann, Ricardo remained silent. He didn't join any political party, write memoirs, or participate in debates about the Holocaust. He chose a career completely alien to the 20th century, near Eastern archaeology. He entered the University of Heidelberg, where he earned his doctorate with a thesis on funerary architecture in ancient Egypt. He then moved on to academic institutions in Mainz and Berlin before joining the German Archaeological Institute, DA1. In 1995, he took over as director of the DAI's Department of the East, where he organized excavations at ancient Syrian cities such as Tel Halaf and worked on joint missions to Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. His work focused on the evolution of urban planning in Semitic civilizations. He published technical articles in academic journals, all of which steered clear of the debate on National Socialism. He never changed his last name. He never sought to erase his origins. In an interview, one of the few he has given, he declared, "I didn't inherit the guilt, but I did inherit the consequences, and everyone decides what to do with them." This phrase sums up his ethical stance. Ricardo never changed his last name, not out of pride, but out of consistency. He didn't speak publicly about his father, nor did he offer himself to the media or documentaries. But when someone asked him, he answered honestly. In 1995, he agreed to meet privately with Zevi Aharoni, the Mossad agent who had captured his father in Buenos Aires. The meeting took place without cameras or journalists in an Israeli government building during an academic visit. There were no recriminations nor apologies, only a mutual recognition of the inevitable. Since then, Ricardo has continued to work as an emeritus researcher. He currently lives in Germany and remains involved in international archaeological projects. He does not participate in commemorative events or debates about the legacy of Nazism. He has stated that his role is that of the present, not the past. Another similar case is that of Matthias Göring, a direct descendant of Hermann Göring. Matthias has maintained an extremely low profile for decades. He has lived in Switzerland and Germany, working as a therapist and teacher, systematically avoiding any prominence linked to his surname. Despite sharing a name and blood with one of the regime's most feared figures, Matthias never sought to distance himself publicly or make statements. His response has been different, a life of integrity, far removed from politics, revisionism, or media hype. He studied medicine and psychotherapy at the University of Heidelberg in the 1970s, and later founded the Institute for Unclean Psychotherapy in Hamm, North Rhine-Westphalia. He specialized in holistic therapies, combining traditional approaches with alternative practices. He never publicly mentioned his relationship with Hermann Göring in lectures, publications, or interviews. Despite being contacted several times by journalists interested in the surname, Matthias declined all requests. On one occasion, he sent a letter to the editor of a local newspaper requesting that his name not be included in articles about World War II. His patients and students know him only through his clinical work. His publications are limited to therapeutic manuals and technical studies. He has never participated in public events linked to Nazism or historical memory initiatives. He currently lives in retirement without social media or public appearances since 2018. In Austria, a similar pattern has been observed among the descendants of Arthur Seyss-Inquart. This man, directly responsible for the annexation of Austria to the Third Reich and later Reich Commissioner in the Netherlands, was executed after the Nuremberg trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity. After his death, his children disappeared from public view. They didn't seek to rehabilitate his image or confront public opinion, nor did they embrace revisionist rhetoric. Seyss-Inquart's grandchildren have lived in Austria as anonymous citizens. Some work as technicians, others as teachers, others in the public sector. They have never made statements, never attended public events linked to Nazism. In occasional interviews, their response has always been the same: "Our duty is not to repeat." Not speaking is not the same as denying, it's simply not being part of what has already been horror enough. What's remarkable in all these cases is that none of these descendants changed their last name. None sought to become a public figure, none made the past a source of visibility or victimhood. Their form of rupture is harder to detect, but no less powerful. It's the ethic of a job well done, the integrity of someone who knows where they come from, but is defined by what they choose to be. This kind of resistance raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. Is exposure always necessary to achieve rupture? Or can a quiet, fair and honest life represent a more powerful message than a memoir or a documentary? The story of Richard Ikeman, Matthias Goering and the descendants of Seyss-Inquart suggests that it is. That silence isn't always denial, that sometimes the greatest act of memory is to live well, to live differently, to live truthfully even if no one sees it. In times when the media rewards public testimony, where visibility seems to be the only form of reparation, these figures remind us that there is also ethics without spectacle, that there are those who do not deny their name, but neither do they use it as a shield, that dignity doesn't require shouting, but rather coherence, and that in the long shadow of the Third Reich, even a silent life can be a form of light. The Hidden Lineage, biographies built on a lie. Hans Graser, a Stuttgart historian, discovered in 2010 that his father had been a member of the SS and had served as a judicial officer in the occupied Eastern Territories. The discovery came not through family confession or academic research. It came when his mother, suffering from Alzheimer's, was moved into a nursing home, and Hans was put in charge of emptying the family apartment. Among old books, yellowed photographs, and forgotten documents, he found a carefully preserved collection of papers. SS certificates, signed letters, transfer orders. His father, whom he always knew as a sober official at the regional court, had served in Riga during the Nazi occupation. Riga was one of the main centers of extermination of Baltic Jews. The Rumbula massacre took place there, where more than 25,000 people were murdered in just 2 days in December 1941. In one of the documents, Graser found a letter in which his father recommended the evacuation of a Jewish neighborhood for hygiene reasons. That cold, bureaucratic phrase devastated him. I knew at that moment that he wasn't just a bystander, he had been part of the machine. Hans then began a personal investigation. He gathered testimonies, searched military archives, and reconstructed the fates of the Riga victims. He discovered that many of the evacuated houses were eventually occupied by German officials, including his father. What shocked him most was not only the harshness of the orders, but their language. Everything was couched in a technical, administrative, almost clinical tone. The phrases spoke of health measures, scheduled movements, or assignment of spaces for authorized personnel. There was no explicit violence in the papers, but there was a structural violence disguised as bureaucracy. Graser became obsessed with this aesthetic of language, how a massacre could be hidden behind an official seal and a neat signature. The revelation changed his academic life. He temporarily abandoned his medieval history classes and devoted himself to writing an essay on the post-war silences in German families. Titled The Unspoken Inheritance, the book was never officially published but circulated among colleagues and students as a key document for understanding how the Third Reich survived in many homes in the form of sweetened family stories. The case of Martin Bormann Jr. is particularly complex. The son of Hitler's powerful private secretary, he grew up worshipping his father, whom he viewed as a hero and an unquestionable authority figure. But when he was 17 after the war, a priest showed him photographs of concentration camps and revealed the pivotal role his father had played in the Holocaust. The revelation was so devastating that after a period of crisis, Martin decided to become a Catholic priest. He dedicated his life to confronting his father's legacy, giving lectures in Germany and Israel on reconciliation and historical responsibility. He traveled to Jewish communities to ask for forgiveness, although he clarified that he could not do so in his father's name, but as someone who bore his name and understood the weight of history. For years, he lived at the Benedictine Abbey of Niederaltaich in Bavaria and participated as a guide on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. In interviews given between the 1990s and his death in 2013, he insisted that silence was a form of complicity and that his only way to come to terms with his family history was to expose it. He never attempted to soften the image of his father. He did not write memoirs or seek notoriety. He spoke only when invited to educational or religious settings, and always with a tone of serene responsibility. In 2011, he appeared briefly in the documentary Hitler's Children, as a figure who did not deny the past, but also did not use it for himself. "Finding the truth was like dying and being reborn," he said in an interview. "Everything I believed about my family, about my father, about my country, collapsed in an instant. What followed was a long process of learning to live with that wound." Nicholas Frank, the youngest son of Hans Frank, the so-called executioner of Poland, grew up knowing that his father had been a powerful figure in the Third Reich. Governor-General of the occupied territories in the East, Hans Frank was one of the main figures responsible for administering the extermination campaign in the Warsaw Ghetto, Krakow, and other centers of repression in Poland. Following the Nuremberg trials, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and executed in 1946. Throughout his childhood, Nicholas was nurtured with an idealized version of his father, a patriot, an unjustly condemned martyr. But as he reached adolescence, documents, photographs, and interviews with survivors began to unravel that narrative. Unlike other children of Nazi leaders who chose silence or justification, Nicholas did the opposite. He decided to expose himself, to denounce, to turn his last name into a payload. He published a book titled My Father, the Nazi Criminal, in which he publicly dismantled the father figure with a fierce, almost surgical tone. In it, he describes his contempt for his father, whom he accuses not only of being a murderer, but also of being a coward. Throughout his life, he has given talks at schools, universities, and Holocaust memorials. He participated in television debates, wrote articles, and has never softened his message. A son's duty is not to defend an inherited lie. In 2011, he also appeared in the documentary Hitler's Children, where he engaged in direct conversation with descendants of Jewish victims. His position is clear. If his father destroyed lives with words and laws, he would try to repair some of that damage by doing exactly the opposite. Nicholas didn't ask for forgiveness on behalf of anyone. He didn't seek to clear his family name or build a new identity. He simply chose to live with the truth without anesthesia. For him, the breakup wasn't a spiritual journey or a personal reconstruction. It was a head-on battle against hypocrisy, both within and outside his family. Siegfried Gauch was born in March 1945, a few weeks before the collapse of the Third Reich. He didn't need to discover his father's past as an adult because he had known it from the beginning. Hermann Gauch, a doctor, SS officer, and author of books on racial hygiene, was a convinced Nazi ideologue. Even though his ideas made even other members of the regime uncomfortable due to their biological radicalism, he remained faithful until his death in 1978. He never renounced what he wrote, nor did he ask for forgiveness. At home, the ideological legacy never disappeared. Throughout his childhood and youth, Siegfried lived with that past without having the tools to process it. He admired it, feared it, respected it, but as he grew up, that legacy became a wound. He didn't want to bury it or deny it, nor make a spectacle of it. In 1979, a year after his father's death, he published Vaterspuren, Traces of the Father, a pioneering work in the genre of critical memoirs about Nazi fathers. It's not a pamphlet, nor a denunciation. It's a quest. An attempt to understand how an identity was built on a paternal role model who was, at the same time, an emotional figure and a propagator of hatred. The book alternates childhood scenes with adult reflections. It doesn't idealize, but it doesn't dramatize either. It speaks of how language, gestures, and ideas are inherited, and how one can begin to dismantle them. Vaterspuren was well received by critics and has been translated into English and Hebrew. Its publication opened a door, that of children who didn't want to perpetuate the silence, but who also found no space in a Germany that was just beginning to speak honestly about the past. Siegfried Gauch did not choose political activism or media exposure. He continued writing. He published novels, essays, and other memoirs, such as Schattenbilder 2012, which delves into the scars Nazism left on his generation. He lives in Mainz. He rarely gives interviews, but his texts maintain one constant, writing as a tool to confront the unspoken. He doesn't seek absolution or redemption, only clarity, only the firm gesture of someone who chooses not to inherit without understanding. Recycled ideology when the past is disguised as democracy. José Antonio Cast, a Chilean politician who rose to prominence in the 2021 presidential elections, in which he contested the runoff against Gabriel Boric. Cast leads the Republican Party of Chile, a party that combines nationalist values, extreme conservatism, and a direct criticism of advances in social rights and historical memory. But what makes him a key figure in this chapter is his heritage. His father, Michael Cast, was a member of the Nazi Party. Michael Cast, born in Bavaria in 1924, officially joined the NSDAP in 1942 when he was just 18 years old. Although after the war he tried to downplay this connection as a youthful imposition, documents from the German Federal Archive confirm his membership number and his participation as an officer in the Nazi army during the war. In 1950, fleeing the collapse of the Reich and the denazification trials, he emigrated to Chile with his wife and first son. There, he founded a sausage company, Cecinas Bavaria, that quickly grew to become one of the industry's leading companies in the south of the country. The Cast surname quickly became known, first in business, then in politics. Michael Cast joined the right-wing Christian Democrats and later became an outspoken defender of Augusto Pinochet's regime. José Antonio Cast, his youngest son, inherited not only the surname but also a worldview that explicitly championed the order of the Chilean military regime. He has publicly defended Pinochet, questioned human rights reports, and been reluctant to acknowledge the violations committed by the dictatorship. During his presidential campaign, Cast denied any direct influence of his father's Nazi past on his ideology, but the historical parallels are impossible to ignore: advocacy of authoritarian nationalism, anti-immigration rhetoric, rejection of historical reparations, and the human rights agenda. His proposal to build a ditch on the northern border to prevent the passage of immigrants, his plan to close the National Institute of Human Rights, and his rejection of sex education in public schools were seen by many as a contemporary recycling of authoritarian values. During her campaign, Cast also proposed eliminating quota laws for women in parliament and reducing state involvement in issues of cultural diversity, even questioning constitutional recognition of the Mapuche people. Her image generates strong support and opposition, but the truth is that she has managed to build a solid political force with parliamentary representation and a strong media presence. In a country still torn between memory and impunity, Cast's rise represents more than just an electoral anomaly. It is proof that certain legacies not only survive, but are effectively adapted to the language of democracy. Another paradigmatic case is that of the descendants of Klaus Barbie, the so-called Butcher of Lyon, a Gestapo officer responsible for the torture and murder of thousands of Jews, resistance fighters, and civilians in France during the Nazi occupation. After the war, Barbie was protected by the US Secret Services, who used him as an informant, and later helped by the Odessa network to escape to Bolivia under the name Klaus Altmann. He lived there for more than 3 decades, protected by military regimes and linked to political repression operations. In Bolivia, Barbie collaborated with Hugo Banzer's dictatorship and advised paramilitary forces on intelligence and counterinsurgency tasks. According to declassified intelligence reports, he was also allegedly involved in Operation Condor, the network of repressive cooperation between dictatorships in the Southern Cone, and facilitated contacts between drug traffickers and local power structures. His legacy was not just that of a fugitive. Barbie built a network of influence that involved politicians, businessmen, and members of the German community in Latin America. The direct descendants of Klaus Barbie, including his son Klaus Georg Altmann, have maintained a position of absolute silence. Georg Altmann lived for years in Spain and Germany, linked to shady business activities, including arms trafficking front companies and security consultancies. In the 1990s, he was investigated in Germany for alleged support for neo-Nazi groups, but was never convicted. His last name remains out of the media spotlight, but his legacy lives on the margins of political and economic networks that have successfully recycled themselves. The most disturbing aspect of the Barbie case is not only the silence of his family, but also the normalization of his story in certain Bolivian circles. For years, Klaus Barbie was protected by local businessmen and politicians who considered him useful in the repression of communism. He was never voluntarily extradited. He only fell after a sustained international campaign led by French activists and investigative journalists. When he was finally tried in France in 1987, the trial revealed not only his crimes but also the protection network that had sustained him for decades. Today, Barbie's name rarely appears in Bolivian public life. There are no plaques, no memorials, no official statements about his time in the country. His story has been absorbed into institutional oblivion, and in that oblivion, his ideological heirs have prospered. Some are linked to international far-right networks, others repurposed into private companies or paramilitary structures. The Barbie case demonstrates that the legacy of the Third Reich lives not only in the surname, but in the networks these men helped build and in the ideologies they managed to disguise themselves as political pragmatism. A lesser-known but equally important figure is Gudrun Burwitz, daughter of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the main architects of the Holocaust. Unlike other descendants who broke with the family legacy, Gudrun maintained an unwavering commitment to her father's memory and to Nazi ideology until her death in 2018. He never accepted Himmler's responsibility for the Holocaust and devoted much of his adult life to rehabilitating his image. He was an active member of Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, an organization that provided legal and financial support to former SS officers and other war criminals. Most disturbing is that Gudrun did not operate from the margins of the system. For decades, she worked as a secretary in the West German Federal Intelligence Service, BND, where, according to declassified documents, she used her position to help former Nazis evade justice. This infiltration of democratic institutions illustrates how the legacy of Nazism does not always come in the form of radical rhetoric, but rather through a silent and effective presence within the system itself. Both cases, Casts and the Barbies, along with figures like Gudrun Burwitz, raise a crucial question for contemporary memory. Have we truly overcome the legacy of Nazism, or has it simply mutated? What happens when the descendants of criminals not only fail to confront their past, but instead use it, implicitly or explicitly, as a political platform? How many family silences have become normalized public discourse? At a time when the far right is gaining ground in Europe, Latin America, and the United States, where hate speech is camouflaged in narratives of freedom or national sovereignty, the analysis of these figures takes on renewed urgency. Democracy as a system does not in itself guarantee a break with the past. It can become, and indeed has become, a stage for new forms of inherited authoritarianism. The symbolic power of certain surnames may disappear from public debate, but their influence continues in legislative decisions, strategic alliances, and speeches that appeal to fear and resentment as political drivers. The Cast Barbie case barely scratches the surface. In Germany, Austria, Argentina, and other countries, dozens of surnames of Nazi origin have returned to public life with discrete profiles, tailored discourse, and power structures that protect them. They don't need to openly declare their affiliation. It's enough to not renounce certain values, to defend certain policies, to keep alive a rhetoric that, in new forms, perpetuates old divisions. Werner Goldberg, a politician with the German conservative CDU party for decades, kept his Jewish origins a secret while advocating restrictive immigration policies and a strong cultural nationalism. Only after his retirement was it discovered that his father, a Jew who converted to Christianity, had survived the Holocaust. His case reflects the complex web of identities and loyalties that characterize the political heirs of Nazism, people willing to defend ideas close to what they themselves, in another context, would have condemned. It's important to note that not all descendants who enter politics do so by adopting authoritarian positions. Nicholas Frank, son of the brutal Governor-General of Poland Hans Frank, executed after the Nuremberg trials, became a left-wing journalist and writer, openly denouncing his father's crimes. His participation in the public sphere has always been as a critic of fascism and a defender of historical memory. His book, My Father, the Nazi Criminal, is a heartbreaking example of how some descendants use their position to combat, not perpetuate, the family legacy. At the other extreme is Rudiger Vonvemar, son of SS General Max Vonvemar, who had a successful diplomatic career in the Federal Republic of Germany, eventually becoming ambassador to the UN and president of the General Assembly. He never publicly mentioned his father's past, but he never disowned it either. His strategy was different. He built a political identity based on Europeanism and international reconciliation, as if the best way to bury the past was to build a present founded on opposing values. These contrasts reveal that the political legacy of Nazism is neither uniform nor predictable. Some embrace it, others fight it. Some hide it under democratic appearances, and others transform it into a compromise with its opposite. What all these stories share is the impossibility of escaping the weight of name, of blood, of history. Alexei's case, Navalny, a jailed Russian dissident who recently died in prison, also reflects this complexity. Portrayed in the West as a champion of democracy against Putin's authoritarianism, Navalny had an early political career where he used ultranationalist rhetoric and compared Caucasian immigrants to cockroaches. Although he has no direct ties to Nazism, his career illustrates how extremist ideas can coexist with democratic discourse, creating political figures that are difficult to categorize. The most serious risk lies not in those who openly proclaim their adherence to Nazi ideals, marginal in the current democratic system, but in those who bring those ideas into spaces of institutional legitimacy. Parties that promote anti-immigrant policies, discourses about the threat of difference, or historical revisions that minimize the Holocaust represent subtle but effective ways of keeping the spirit of fascism alive without the need for swastikas or uniforms. The Duce's heirs, the Mussolini lineage. Unlike many heirs of the Third Reich who opted for silence, a change of surname, or critical confrontation, the descendants of Benito Mussolini have followed a different path: visibility. While in Germany the legacy of Nazism generates rupture or family distance, in Italy the surname Mussolini has reappeared time and again in the public sphere. Often not as a burden, but as a platform. A century after the March on Rome, his surname remains present in institutions, campaigns, and ballot boxes. Benito Mussolini had 5 children with Rachele Guidi, his partner since 1910 and wife since 1916. From that main branch came musicians, pilots, mayors, MEPs, and councillors. Their descendants have not simply lived under the shadow of an uncomfortable surname. In many cases, they have openly claimed it, or at least have integrated it without renouncing it. The most visible figure in recent decades is Alisandra Mussolini, born in 1962, daughter of the Duce's youngest son, Romano Mussolini, and Anna Maria Ciccolone, sister of Sofia Loren. Alisandra was a singer and actress in her youth, but she has dedicated herself to politics since the 1990s. She has served as a national representative, a member of the European Parliament, and a spokesperson for ultra-conservative positions. She was a member of Forza Italia, Silvio Berlusconi's party, and later led her own political party, Alternativa Sociale, with a nationalist platform and identity-based discourse. She has made public statements defending aspects of the fascist regime and downplaying its crimes, which has made her a controversial figure both at home and abroad. Alisandra is not an isolated case. Her half-sister, Rachele Mussolini, born in 1975, Romano's daughter with another partner, has followed a more discreet but equally public career. She was a model and participated in beauty pageants before entering politics. She is currently a councillor on the Rome City Council for Fratelli d'Italia, Giorgia's party, Meloni. Although he avoids explicit ideological references, he has stated that he has no reason to hide his surname and that his commitment is more linked to his territory and work than to his family history. His active presence in the party that currently governs Italy reflects that the name Mussolini remains politically viable. Another prominent figure is Kaio Giulio Cesare Mussolini, the dictator's great-grandson, a former career military officer and naval specialist. In 2019, he ran for the European Parliament, also for Fratelli d'Italia. Although he was not elected, his campaign was widely covered by the press. "I'm proud of my last name," he declared in interviews. "I'm not a fascist, but I am Mussolini." His rhetoric appealed to national pride and sovereignty, avoiding direct historical debates. Outside of politics, the surname has been present in other areas. Alisandra's son, Romano Floriani Mussolini, plays as a defender in the youth divisions of Lazio. Although he has publicly stated that his surname has nothing to do with football, he is frequently the subject of media attention, especially when playing against teams whose fans identify with anti-fascist views. He naturally bears a surname that in other countries would have been grounds for concealment or legal modification. The public genealogy of the family dates back to the eldest daughter of Mussolini, Edda, married in 1930 to Count Galeazzo Ciano, the regime's foreign minister. After the fall of the Duce, Ciano was accused of treason and executed. Edda managed to flee disguised as a peasant and survived the war, preserving her husband's political diaries, later published as key testimony for the regime. Her son, Fabrizio Ciano, published the book When Grandfather Shot Dad in 1991, a bitter chronicle of family betrayal. She died in 2008 after a life marked by the conflict between her family name and her conscience. Other family branches have also held public office. Edenegri Mussolini, granddaughter of the Duce's youngest daughter, was mayor of Germano, in the province of Rimini. She is the author of a biography of her grandmother entitled Donna Rachele, Mia Nonna, in which she offers an intimate view of the dictator's wife, removed from the official image. The work seeks to rescue the figure of a woman relegated by history without making an explicit political claim. Even descendants who have avoided politics have kept the surname unchanged. Mussolini's son Romano, a jazz pianist and painter, never took a political role, but he never renounced his father. His marriage to Sophia Loren's sister attracted media attention, and for years his family was the subject of reports, interviews, and special coverage in the press and on television. Today, Mussolini's villa in Forlì is a museum. Postcards, busts, and T-shirts are sold inside. Some make the pilgrimage out of nostalgia, others out of morbid curiosity, some out of conviction. In any case, the name Mussolini has not been erased from the Italian political map. In recent years, its use has ceased to be marginal and has re-entered the electoral fray. Unlike the descendants of Himmler, Goebbels, or Ikeman, many of Benito Mussolini's heirs have not only kept their surname but have used it as a public tool. None have written memoirs of rupture, none have led educational campaigns about the crimes of fascism. None have changed their identity. Instead, some have used that lineage as a brand, and others simply as family continuity. What generates rejection in Germany generates votes in Italy. The political context has also been different. Anti-fascism in Italy has coexisted with a cultural legacy of nostalgia, with legal neo-fascist parties and with a right wing that has at times relativized the past. The rise of Giorgia Meloni, whose political formation has roots in post-war neo-fascism, has further normalized the environment so that descendants of the Duce can hold office without massive controversy. 100 years after the March on Rome, the Mussolini lineage is still present. Not from the shadows or from remorse, but from the microphone, the ballot, and the seat.